Okay. Good day, everyone. I'm excited. We've come to the last edition for the year. Hi, Philip. It's good to see you. I'm waiting for Tolu and David. They will join us shortly. But Philip, how do you feel?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon.
Anyone you say is fine. So how do you feel today?
Good.
Good. You said just good. That's all.
Well, good can be very good.
Just a quick hi, Tolu. Finally, you're here. So we're starting now. Yes. So today, guys, it's pretty much you can go any direction you like. But just a recap, we started this Q1 this year, and this will be our final edition for 2021. And we'll be doing pretty much latest recap of what Q3, Q4 looked like this year. We'll go back to some of the conversations we had earlier on in the year around FX crisis, which pretty much still is right in our face. We'll do a bit of inflation. We'll talk about climate change. And from there, slowly we'll move into how to position ourselves at an individual level for 2022. And we'll be giving up space for anyone interested in private investment strategy sessions to have with anyone on the Ecofina team. So, Tolu, how are you feeling today?
I'm fine, thank you. I have a family event, so you can naturally understand I may be ecstatic. I'm happy, yeah, so yeah, I'm good. Thank you very much. And you, how are you?
I'm doing awesome, Okay, so I want us to start with a big one that's Philip, you had a short video on it sometime, maybe October, September. That's the Evergrande debt issues, which we saw in Q3, and still pretty much Q4, even though lately you've not been seeing much of it, but I'm very aware it's something everyone needs to be paying attention to. So if you don't mind, could you just share like major highlights, the recap of the event, what's the trigger, and what kind of implication are we looking at? I think we should start from that particular economic issue, because that was something a lot of people didn't really pay close attention to. So do you want to start with that?
Okay, thank you so much for me. So Evergrande, of course, looked very much like it was going to throw the entire global economy into the same crisis as Lehman Brothers did in 2008. But so far, despite the huge debt, I think they are still finding a way to keep it out of, they are still finding a way out at the moment. No one knows how long they are going to be able to sustain that. But they declared it themselves that they were facing unprecedented crisis in repaying some of their debts, both locally and also foreign debts. An estimate of the debts amounts to around $305 billion. Now, even for a company in China, that's still about 2% of the Chinese economy in terms of GDP. So for someone to incur debts as high as 2% of the Chinese GDP, that's must really be a huge debt. So, of course, they had challenges, and they even had to renegotiate some of their, debt repayment terms. But the genesis really is that they had a big goal. All this. I want to be very, very big. I want to, do the best I can in the world. Dominate and all that. And they started more or less like a construction company. But they started getting into many unrelated businesses. So they got into tourism, got into football, got into health, got into everything you can think of. And then, this debt started to build. And the way it is, not only I think in the world, when you see that a company is big, sometimes the due diligence is not as high as when the small company comes along and says, I need to borrow from you. So what happened essentially is that many of the banks or financial institutions did not know the level of exposure Evergrande had. So they continued to lend to them, not knowing exactly how bad really the situation had become. But by the time, they declared that, they have issues, then everybody started running helter-skelter. Now, what is important is that, let me just give you a simple example. So when they got into football, for instance, they bought a club called Guangzhou Evergrande for probably around $185 million. And then, they are building a stadium, which they feel should be, which will be one of the biggest, if not the biggest in the world. They are building it for around $1.5 billion. Yesterday, you imagine that Reuters reported that the government has instructed them, or the government is trying to take over the stadium, more or less, as one of the ways to help them repay the debt. And they started to sign players from all over. I'm sure Debo and Tolu will remember that, we just started hearing that there's a Chinese club signing the big guys in Europe. You were wondering that what is happening in China. Is China now a football country? But, they were spending a lot of money on almost everything, and it got them into serious trouble. Trouble that now they are trying to recover from. Yesterday, it emerged that the owner, Yuajin, sold about 9% stake for around $344 million. So they are doing all they can to actually recover from this debt crisis. And what is also interesting is that, such companies are limited liability. But I understand that China has instructed the owner to pay up with his own fortune instead of allowing the company to go down. So forget what is limited liability to China. So I guess those are some of the ways in which they are able to manage the crisis. Because the guy, if you look at the situation as well, they paid about $8 billion in dividends to him over the years. Since the IPO, they paid $8 billion to the founder in dividends, and he's worth about $11.5 billion, which means that a larger percentage of his wealth comes from the dividend payments from Evergrande. And now it looks like they were financing most of that dividend payments from debt. So they take debts, and use it to fund dividend payments. So if you look at it, corporate governance, everything seems to have gone wrong, but it seems many of the financial institutions didn't notice on time, and that's why we are here now.
Okay, that sounds like an interesting one. Just hearing the fact that you take debt to pay dividends, that sounds like total violation of why and where you should be paying dividends at all. Debo, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Philip really covered the entire story. And maybe the situation actually would have continued if the Chinese government had not put a peg on how much debt companies could take on. Probably they would have continued borrowing, even borrowed to also pay the interest on the outstanding debt that brought the whole situation out, because the whole thing came out because of the need to pay interest. And also it's interesting now that, okay, it seems calm because they were able to meet the current obligation, but the bigger picture is the one that is actually due in March. So we would see how well they have been able to manage the situation, because it's in March that the 3.2 billion is due. The ones they paid recently are like maybe $50 million and $70 million. So let's see how they cope. Again, some of the, like Philip mentioned, they actually went out of the areas where they have excelled. They excelled initially in residential properties. And residential properties is easier to manage because you don't take a lot of loans at the beginning of executing your project. You only take loan to build the infrastructure, then you wait for customers to buy into it. So the amount of loan you take up when you're doing residential property is not as large as when you now start taking other type of loan, like building the stadium. For building stadium, you need to take the entire loan to do the stadium, and then also getting into other businesses, perhaps where they did not have expertise. I think those are some of the things that led to their situation. And like Philip said, of course, I'm sure the Chinese government is going to be tough on them. They have started selling all sorts of assets. I heard the owner also said 2 airplane private jets that he had already. They also sold some of the stakes they have in fact, they sold all their stakes in a particular Chinese bank also as well. So they are raising money from every angle. So let's see how much they are able to raise and how we'll get, I'm sure we'll get a better picture by the time the March situation comes through and how they handle it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dave. So, Philip, I'm coming back to you now. Just given the fact that Dave said we have March to determine if the Chinese government's control of the situation is really effective, and everyone should be curious to know, what if it turns out the Chinese government's approach to resolving this is not as effective as we expect it to be? What kind of reactions should we see in the Asian markets? And what do we think the global markets would look like?
I think it's going to be, I think we don't want to even imagine what the consequences would be, given the size of the company. But let's just hope that they can at least manage it to a level where the effect on the global economy is not as bad as it probably should be. But I think the steps they are taking so far, like I said, it's supposed to be a limited liability company, but they're asking him to pay out of his own fortune as well. What people do is that, you file for bankruptcy, then you go away. Probably tell us more about what they do in America and some of those places. So you file for bankruptcy and then but I don't think you can do that in China. And I think that's the only, that's probably what should give some comfort.
David, did you want to say something?
Yeah, you're right, Philip. Bankruptcy is one easy way people get out of this situation here where, okay, you create a problem and then you file for bankruptcy and then the problem becomes, of course, every other investor's problem. But like Philip said, I think it's going to be a different situation here. I was also listening to some analysts from the Wall Street, and they were comparing the situation to the Lehman Brothers in the 2008, and the consensus in that discussion was kind of saying, oh, this is going to be different. Yes, even if they fail, this situation might be limited to the Asian market. Remember, I think they are traded in Hong Kong, so that the analysts at least believe that it will not become a global situation, that it will be limited in that area. But again, part of that confidence is coming from the fact that the Chinese government will treat things differently, like they have started doing, making the guy sell some of his assets. And then, of course, the only concern that analysts are having is in terms of, okay, how does it affect investors' confidence, but not necessarily creating a situation that is similar to what we had in 2008.
Okay, that's an interesting approach to it, and I somewhat agree. Tolu?
Yes, gentlemen. Thank you very much. And I think Philip and Deborah, they've covered it, quite extensively. It's just the landing that I also want to contribute to, right? Yeah. The Economist magazine is reporting that this Evergrande problem is actually symptomatic of the reality in China today, right? Where business moguls, companies, they have their operations in the industry like real estate, and other sectors, construction and similar sectors like that. But then they also hold shareholding in banks, right? And they get these banks to provide leverage for them to do this kind of transactions with a relatively easy credit condition. And Economist is reporting that this is just not an Evergrande problem. There are thousands of Chinese companies, particularly in the provinces, that have this problem that the Chinese government is now trying to manage and the same approach that Debo and Felix have said is, this is not US where you could file for bankruptcy, create a problem, file for bankruptcy, and run away. The Chinese government will come to you, leave the bill of incorporation and come after the individuals behind the scene. So, let's hope that that approach works, right? And, because if we begin to imagine the scale of what this crisis could be for the global financial markets, it could be massive, right? But, again, this is China we're talking about, and there's little scope to be extremely wise against government wishes.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Thank you for wrapping that up. And just as we talk about